For a change of scenery, today we're down here in Southern California taking a look at the all-new 2021 Chevy Tahoe and Chevy Suburban. Now, the one in front of me right here is a Chevy Tahoe, but we're going to be talking about both of these models because they're essentially long and short versions of one another. Also because they compete very directly with the Expedition and Expedition Max, the short and long version of the Ford competition. And this and the Expedition are really the only two large SUVs in America that come in short and long versions, obviously excluding the closely related cousins in the GMC and Cadillac lineup. GM has been in the big SUV game longer than absolutely anyone, and this is now the 12th generation of what is the Tahoe and Suburban. It started back in 1934 with a 1935 model year vehicle that had 3 rows of seats and seated as many people as you could jam in there because there were no seat belts. But the formula remains the same, a station wagon body on top of theoretically a half-ton truck platform. Although this generation Tahoe and Suburban really don't share as much directly with their pickup truck line as you might think. Unlike that first Suburban from nearly a century ago, General Motors did not simply graft on a station wagon body on top of the Silverado. This is really quite a unique vehicle under the skin because not only does this have an independent rear suspension, but it also has a full 4-corner air suspension, which we don't find in the Silverado. Now, logically, there are going to be some things that are shared between the two vehicles. We have similar engine lineups under here, including the inline-6 turbo diesel that we find in the Silverado 1500, and then we have a very similar design language to the vehicle up front. All models for 2021 will get full LED headlights. The turn signals are integrated into this little curvy strip right here, and there are several different grille looks depending on the trim level that you get. There are going to be 6 different trim levels for the Tahoe. Today we're driving the Z71, which is sort of the sportier version. I like this grille a lot, but I also think that I like the Premier grille a little bit better. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. We do have some really nice touches like these red tow hooks up front. If it's not immediately obvious, the Tahoe has grown significantly for 2021. There's a reason for that. When you take a look at 3-row crossovers like Chevy's own Traverse, the former generation Tahoe didn't really give you that much more interior room, even though it was a lot bigger on the outside. But that is certainly different for this generation Tahoe. We have 66% more cargo room in the back, 10 inches more legroom than the previous generation. And a lot of that is helped by the stretch that we find in the Tahoe, but a lot of it also is helped out by that new independent rear suspension, which really improves packaging in the rear, allows the seats to sit a little bit differently in the back, give you more headroom, and a more comfortable driving position. We also have the latest 10-speed automatic transmissions from General Motors lineup, and again, that all-new diesel engine. At 210.7 inches long, this generation Tahoe is about 7 inches longer than its predecessor. The Suburban also grows a little bit for 2021, but not by quite as much. It's up to 225.7 inches long. When taking a look at the competition, the Tahoe is going to be the model that's going to compete with the likes of the Nissan Armada, the Toyota Sequoia, and of course the Ford Expedition. You can also see this as a definite upgrade in terms of interior size and in terms of towing capability versus something like the Chevy Traverse. Versus the Dodge Durango, things are a little bit tricky. The Durango is sort of a competitor, but really the Durango is down there in the more crossover segment rather than the full-size SUV segment. It's significantly smaller on the inside. On the inside, the Durango is about the same size as a Highlander, and this is significantly larger. Versus the Ford lineup, the Expedition is just about the same length as this Tahoe now, 210 inches for that model, 210.7 for this one right here. But the Expedition Max is a little bit shorter than the Suburban, and it's important to note that in the Expedition Max, when they stretch the back end, you simply get more cargo area. You don't get more legroom. And that's been one of the unique things about the Tahoe versus Suburban pairing is that Chevy doesn't just give you more rear cargo room, they actually move the third row back a little bit, giving you more legroom than you find in the Tahoe, about 2 inches more in the third row. The Tahoe and Suburban have long been known for having styling that's not fussy or cluttered, and we certainly find that for 2021. We have some fairly simple shapes back here and a very clean upright rear end that really maximizes cargo capacity in the back, something that the average Tahoe and Suburban shopper are certainly looking for. One thing that surprises me back here is that we have combination tail lamp modules. So the brake lights and parking lights are LEDs, but the turn signals and backup lights are incandescent bulbs. And they are mounted in these very large clear housings. Moving to the bottom of the bumper, we find well-integrated parking sensors, no visible exhaust tips down there. The trailer hitch receiver is tucked up under that cover, and a really nice touch back here, which is disappearing in so many SUVs and crossovers, is that we have a rear window glass that opens separately from the hatch. Keeping the look clean, Chevy tucks the windshield wiper right up here under that rear spoiler. The spoiler is part of the glass, and interestingly enough, the windshield wiper does not move with the glass. Behind the cover, we find the 2-inch receiver, a 4-pin and a 7-pin wiring harness connector, but it is worth noting that this 2-inch receiver is pretty flush with the bumper. It doesn't really bump out like we see in some of the competition. That does mean that some of those closer trailer arrangements could be a little bit trickier. If you're looking for a three-row vehicle in America that will tow over 6,000 pounds, you have very few options at the moment. And if you want that three-row vehicle to be able to accommodate 8 seats, you have even fewer, because options like the Dodge Durango, which will tow up to 8,700 pounds for 2021, a little bit more than this Tahoe right here, will only seat 7 or 6, depending on your configuration. But the Tahoe is 7 or 8. Towing will depend on the engines and the options that you select. The Tahoe that will tow the most is going to be the one with the base engine and rear-wheel drive. If you choose the 6.2-liter V8, that'll drop things down a little bit. And if you choose the Suburban, which is of course longer and heavier, that will drop things further down to a low of 7,900 pounds. That puts this right between the 2 tow ratings in the Ford Expedition lineup. The Expedition is good for 9,300 pounds maximum if you choose all the right option boxes, but standard towing ability is 6,600 pounds. As with every Tahoe sold up to this point, this is still a body-on-frame SUV, and that's something that's important when it comes to towing, because the way this sounds while it's towing and the way that it feels while it's towing is going to be different than a unibody SUV or crossover like a Dodge Durango that does have a high towing rating, or a BMW X5, or a Mercedes-Benz GLE or GLS, any of those large luxury crossovers that are unibody vehicles. That's because the trailer is connecting to the frame in the vehicle. Beneath the body that we're seeing here, there's an independent frame that is somewhat isolated from the body. And as your trailer is hopping and bopping around in that receiver, there's some isolation between that frame member and the cabin in the vehicle. So towing is going to be a lot quieter, and it's generally going to feel a little bit more like towing with a pickup truck than towing with a car. And the average crossover out there feels a little bit more like you're towing with a car. At least for the moment, there are going to be 3 engines available under this hood, similar to what we see in the Chevy Silverado. We have a 5.3-liter V8 engine. It produces 355 horsepower and 383 pound-feet of torque. We then get an up-level 6.2-liter V8 that produces 420 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque. And if you want to burn diesel, there's an option now for you, a new 3-liter inline-6 diesel, also shared with the Silverado 1500. That produces 277 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque. Both the 5.3 and 6.2-liter V8 engines under this hood use General Motors' latest dynamic fuel management technology. Instead of simply shutting down the same 4 cylinders every time, this engine could theoretically operate as a 1-cylinder engine, a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or even an 8-cylinder engine whenever it wants to save fuel. And it does so by firing the cylinders in some interesting patterns that really disguise the fact that cylinder deactivation is in operation. Unlike other cylinder deactivation engines where you can really tell by the sound of the engine or a little bit of a lag when the cylinders are being turned on and off, with this system, you really can't tell what it's up to. The model that we're driving today is the 5.3-liter V8 4-wheel drive version. This is EPA rated for 18 miles per gallon combined. That's 1 mile per gallon combined less than the comparable Ford Expedition. But in real-world driving, these V8 engines are incredibly efficient. Now, in this video, I haven't had a lot of time to drive the Tahoe. Unfortunately, I've been down here in Southern California, so we aren't going to have our usual run-through of the numbers in the drive section. You will have to stay tuned for that. But I can say that in general, Chevy's engines have really punched above their weight when it comes to real-world fuel economy, especially out on the open highway. Although I haven't been able to spend as much time as I'd like in the Tahoe so far, I do find these front seats to be pretty comfortable. One thing that I find unusual, however, is that we have just 2-way adjustable lumbar support, not 4-way adjustable lumbar support. Remember, the price tag on this model is about $76,000. We do, however, have a powered tilt telescopic steering column that is memory linked to the 2-position memory over there on the doors, and we have a passenger seat with the same range of motion as the driver's seat. I haven't been able to drive the Cadillac Escalade just yet. I expect those seats are going to be obviously more comfortable than these seats, and it could be that GM is simply saving some of those more expensive options in terms of seat technology for the upper end models, but I really wish, again, for about $76,000 here, that we did get 4-way lumbar. Hopping into the back, the Tahoe's stretch isn't immediately obvious, but that's because a lot of the room is reserved back there for the 3rd row. And of course, the Tahoe has always had a pretty comfortable 2nd row. These seats have a very similar feel to the front seats. They're a little bit less comfortable, but the difference is not enormous. They have a pretty decent recline mechanism as well. I can scoot these forward so you can see really how reclined these 2nd row seats get. And of course, they also slide forward and backward to help you apportion the legroom more equitably between the front, 2nd, and 3rd rows. With the front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall and the 2nd row seat slid all the way forward, I still have about an inch of legroom, and obviously I could be very comfortable in all 3 rows with this in more of a rearward position. The model I'm driving today is a 7-passenger Tahoe, so we have captain's chairs here in the 2nd row, 2 up front, 2 here in the 2nd row, and then 3 people back there in the 3rd row. We also have this large panoramic moonroof, which does seem to drop rear headroom down a little bit, but sitting back here in an upright position in the 2nd row, I still have about an 1.5 inches of headroom left. We also have these large touchscreen infotainment systems back here that we'll take a look at in a bit. Getting into the third row is pretty easy. It's a simple double pull of the recline lever there on the second row seats, and then those tilt forward in that fashion rather than tilting and collapsing like we see in some vehicles, and then pull it right back into place. Then I will make sure it is all the way back in its tracks so we can get a good view of third row legroom here. That is all the way back there. Combined legroom figures in the Tahoe are nothing short of impressive. We have 121.4 inches of combined legroom. That's front row plus second row plus third row. If you want to find more legroom in your next three-row vehicle, you'll have to look at a full-size van, not a full-size SUV. That puts this generation of Tahoe almost exactly the same as the current generation of the Ford Expedition. But if you get the Suburban, you get 2 inches more combined legroom than you'll find in even the long version of that Ford. And more importantly, of course, you'll find a whopping 12 inches more combined legroom in here than you'll find in something like a Toyota Highlander. And that's really obvious. Again, with this seat all the way back in its tracks, the second row person had 7 or 8 inches of legroom. I have still about an inch of legroom back here, and I have a ton of headroom, arguably a bit more headroom than in the second row because of the way the ceiling is shaped due to that large panoramic moonroof. And getting all that headroom does not mean that the seat bottom cushion is slammed all the way to the floor. Now, it's certainly closer to the floor than the second row or the first row, so it's going to be a little bit less comfortable for adults. You can see that my knees are not really there on that seat cushion, but it's an awful lot closer than in many crossovers out there. Something like a Ford Explorer, those seats are practically on the ground. It's sort of like sitting on a cushion that you took off a chair and put on the ground. That's not what's going on in here. Third row passengers also get some well-integrated air vents right here in the ceiling, USB charge-only ports in the back, some cup holders back here as well, but the third row seats don't recline, and the shoulder belt for the center seat position comes out of the ceiling. The previous generation Tahoe had 3 problems that may not seem related on the surface, but indeed they are related. The cargo area wasn't as big as many 3-row crossovers that you'll find in America. The third row was not as spacious as many of the mid-size 3-row crossovers in America. And it wasn't as much fun to drive as other big SUVs out there. But all 3 of those things have been solved with the new independent suspension back here. That gives us significantly more cargo room. We now have 25.5 cubic feet of space behind the third row. That puts this cargo area about 4 to 5 cubic feet ahead of even the largest 3-row crossovers available right now. And if you get the Suburban, that balloons out to 41.5 cubic feet. This is ahead of the Expedition in both categories, 5 cubic feet above the small Expedition and about 5 cubic feet above the big Expedition if you're comparing that to the Suburban. The new independent suspension design has also allowed them to put the load floor closer to the ground because everything down there is just more compact and more easily packaged. We still have a spare tire. It's under the vehicle, so the spare tire's under there. We have more third row room and we have a bigger cargo area. And if I pull these bags out of the cargo area right back here, we find a little bit of additional storage space right here under the load floor as well. Outside of a minivan, if you want a vehicle that seats 7 or 8 passengers and still has room for some luggage in the back, this is going to be one of the few options. And if you're looking for something that can carry 7 people and 7 people's luggage if they pack lightly, that would be the Suburban. I don't know how many of our 24-inch roller bags will fit back here, but I can say that you can likely fit about 6 of these 22-inch carry-on style roller bags right back here behind the third row. As you'd expect, the third row features a power folding design. We can also flip and fold the second row seats from the third row right back here. Because the third row got closer to the floor, the second row seats had to be redesigned so that way they collapse down there a little bit further to be level with the third row. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in a Z71 trim with a bunch of options, so obviously you're not going to find everything here in the base trim. We have the OnStar buttons right here in the center console, the controls for the large panoramic moonroof shade right there. This button here is really interesting. This is the power sliding second console, which we will take a look at in a bit. Keep that in mind. We then have buttons to power fold the seats in the back right here. That's kind of a handy touch, so you don't have to reach back there to do that. We also have the control for the rear hatch right here, and you can adjust its height setting with that little knob. And then our typical HomeLink universal transmitters, 3 of them right up there. Again, this model has this large panoramic moonroof. It goes to just over that second row passenger seat, so you can see how that looks. This is a really big sheet of glass. It appears a little bit smaller in here than you might think just because of the size of the Tahoe overall. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable headrests, and you can see those rear seat entertainment screens from this angle. This interior has leather upholstery, and rather unfortunately, this particular trim is black on black on black, which is a little bit more difficult to film. Obviously, there are other color choices available. Bolstering on the seat back and bottom cushions isn't too aggressive, so larger folks shouldn't have any problem there. There's a ton of storage going on inside here. We have a large bin down there at the bottom of the door, a smaller one midway up. That's the handle grab right there for the door. Obviously, everything has the latest styling from Chevy here. We also have some imitation wood trim on the doors. It's pretty realistic. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. The dashboard has a bit more of what I guess you could call passenger car-like styling. We have a soft touch injection molded upper section of the dashboard, some different textured materials going on right here in the middle, and then harder plastics down there at the bottom of that dash. We have a pretty decently sized bin-style glove compartment. I was able to fit a large tablet computer inside. On the passenger side of the dash, we have a little storage cubby here, which is kind of an interesting place to put it. You cannot quite fit a large smartphone inside, but that gives you an idea as to how deep that storage area is. In the middle of the dashboard, we find an infotainment system that's just over 10 inches, but the orientation of the screen is a little bit different than some. It doesn't have that really extreme letterbox look that we find in some of the options out there. I think that this look is a little bit more pleasing to my eye because it does make interacting with maps, for instance, a little bit easier because the map is nice and large there when you're using Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Apple CarPlay is wireless in this generation, which is another nice touch. You can see I don't have any wires going on right there. And this gets the latest version of Chevy's infotainment system, very similar software to what we see in the Chevy Silverado trucks. And along with that, we also get their latest trailering technology, which unfortunately I haven't been able to completely demo down here in Southern California, but it is almost exactly the same as the technologies that we find in the Chevy Silverado. This system supports multiple trailer profiles. As you can see, it tracks the status of mileage, fuel economy, electrical connections, etc. There's a smartphone app that will assist you in connecting your trailer. If you've ever been doing this on your own, you know that if you want to check your lights, etc., it can be a pain to do that yourself, especially the brake light, but you can use the app to run you through those connections. You can also choose whether you want to be alerted that a trailer has been connected. You can have it remind you that you need to engage tow haul mode, and the blind spot monitoring system will now detect the trailer and its length. The big screen also makes projection of the 360-degree camera system pretty useful. You can see it gives us a really large image over there and a really nice crisp one as well. We don't have all the same kind of camera angles that we see in the Silverado lineup. However, we don't have the invisible trailer functionality. That is one thing that would be really handy here. On the right side of the screen, we get the 360-degree camera view. It's a little bit hard to see here, but if I crank the wheel, this will show you where the tires are going to go. Front tires, and then a separate line for that rear tire right there. That's because, of course, front and rear tires are not going to track in the same direction. Now, that's the front camera view, which is also showing us that predictive line. I can switch over to the rear view, and then that would get some lines. If I put this in reverse, you can see that we now have that arc for the front tire going in reverse there, so a ton of different views going on. We can also get a top-down view of the rear, a top-down view of the front, right like that. The sides, that's the two sides of the vehicle, and that can be front and rear, so you can see exactly what's going on there. There's a more trailer-focused view where we can see right down the midline of the vehicle. If I put this in reverse, then you can see that that would be very handy for backing your trailer up and seeing exactly where that hitch ball was going to go. And speaking of hitch balls, if you want to know exactly where the center line is, I can click this little button, and that's going to give us a center line rather than those cross lines that we find right there. And we can click this button if we want the full screen view rather than that split side by side. Zooming out from there, we find the push and pull shifter over here to the left. Park is a push, reverse is a pull, neutral's a push, and then drive is a pull. We then have low, that's a push button as well, and then up and down for the gear selection. To the right of that, we have two decently sized air vents, and then below that, we find some of the physical buttons for the infotainment system, as well as the dual zone climate control. We have physical volume knob right over there, track forward, backward button, home button, and then the controls for the dual zones up front, and then we can toggle over to the rear climate with that button right there. And that brings us over to the rear climate control screen right here in the infotainment system. You can go ahead and sync that with the front. You can also click over there and see the front climate settings in the screen if you'd rather do that as well. At the very bottom of the console, we have a 12-volt power port, USB and USB-C inputs, SD card slot right there for the navigation database, and then a very large wireless charging mat. You shouldn't have any problem charging those really large smartphones, and then two big cup holders just behind that. And then we have what I think is one of the coolest features in here. It's the power sliding center console. That was cool enough. Let's see it go back, and then let's see it slide again. With the center console slid into its rear position there, you can see that we can still open that center console and access that large storage bin right there. Tons of room in there. These are the wireless headsets for the rear seat entertainment system. And then under that, we have another little storage area where you can squirrel away goodies. You might be able to fit some of the smaller tablet computers in there. And then we have this large area where you can put purses, bins, any of that kind of stuff right down there in the center. There's a lot of storage going on here. And I have to admit that when I first heard of this power sliding center console, I thought it sounded a little bit gimmicky, but in person, I have to say, this is really cool. Just in case you're wondering, this isn't just about front seat practicality, it also brings the rear seat cup holders for the second row nice and close to the second row passengers, as well as those controls and the USB charge-only ports. That's pretty darn cool any way you slice it. It's really obvious in this generation that Chevy was interested in improving parts quality, fit and finish, and just general interior appearance. You can really see that over here on the driver's side through the steering wheel, where we have all the stitch materials going on here right around that engine start-stop button. It definitely feels much more premium than the last generation. Chevy even decided to give us a new remote control for 2021. There's even a separate button there to open the rear hatch glass. The model that we're driving has the optional large LCD right here between the speedometer and tachometer. We don't have the option of a full LCD instrument cluster in the Tahoe at this time, although there is an available heads-up display. As with the infotainment system, this software is pretty similar to the Silverado truck lineup. You can see we get our typical trip computer readouts there, air filter life, brake life, turn-by-turn navigation directions, a phone interface, settings for this interface, as well as some auxiliary gauges up top, which are really handy. Moving out from there, we find a 4-spoke steering wheel. You'll find the controls for the cruise control system over here on the left, along with the heated steering wheel button, and the controls for that multifunction LCD over here on the right. You'll notice that we don't have any track up-down buttons on the front of the steering wheel. That's because they're on the back. We have volume up-down over here on the right, and then track up-down on the back of the steering wheel on the left. On the left side of the steering wheel, we have a ton of buttons. We have a button for electric parking brake, the lane detection system, parking sensors, auto start stop, the inverter in the vehicle. You can turn that on and off right there. Hill descent control, traction control button right down there. The controls for the 4-wheel drive system over here, auto, 2 high, 4 high, 4 low. We do have a 2-speed transfer case, something that generally separates crossovers from SUVs. And then down here, we have kind of a 2-function knob. If we toggle it side to side, this controls the drive mode, normal, sport, off-road, tow, haul. And then if we press this button and then toggle that, that changes the height of the suspension system. We do have the adaptive air suspension in this vehicle. We have headlight controls right over here, auto right up there, dimmer, and then an integrated trailer brake controller, another feature that we typically don't find in crossovers, but something that's absolutely essential if you're going to be towing a heavier trailer. For our drive section, I'm out here in the natural habitat of the full-size SUV, the Suburban concrete jungle. And this is where you're really going to notice a huge difference between the previous generations of the Tahoe and the current one that we're driving right here. The suspension in this is simply light years ahead of the previous generation Tahoe. A lot of that has to do with the independent rear suspension, but a lot of it also has to do with the particular suspension that we find in the model that I'm driving right now. The model that we're driving has not only a full 4-corner adaptive height air suspension, but it also has MagneRide dampers on it. This is kind of an interesting combination. It allows this system the best of both worlds. The kind of damping and suspension adjustability that you'd find in a regular MagneRide system with the adaptive height functionality that you'd normally find in a full air suspension. General Motors does say that the frame of this vehicle is based on the same frame that we find in the Silverado 1500, but obviously there's some key differences in order to incorporate the kind of suspension technologies that we find in here. However, it does mean that it would be theoretically possible for them to move this kind of system into their pickup truck line at some point in the future, and I really hope that they do, because the ride quality in here is absolutely incredible for a full-size SUV. I'm in here all by myself. This vehicle is designed for over 1,000 pounds of payload inside. That's what you'd need in order to put 8 passengers and some cargo in the back and still be able to tow a small trailer on the rear. You need a lot of payload. But even in that setup, the ride quality here is still absolutely great. What I guess you would call a run-of-the-mill adaptive suspension system wouldn't be able to accomplish the same feat with the same smoothness, because you need the adaptive air springs in there in order to support the load that gives us the payload ability that you'd expect in a vehicle this size that has tow ratings this size. And with a system that can simply control the damping but not the spring rate, the springs are still going to need to be pretty firm in order to be able to support the kind of weight that you'd put in a large SUV like this. Obviously, I haven't had this at home to run this through our usual battery of tests, but I'm going to go ahead and estimate that 0 to 60 is probably going to be around 9 seconds. Remember, we have under 360 horsepower in here, and this weighs nearly 6,000 pounds. As tested here, it's right around 5,900 pounds. If you're looking for a vehicle with more of a sporty vibe, then logically a full-size SUV is probably not the best place to look. But there is an RST trim of this, and there's also a 6.2-liter V8 engine available, and those are certainly going to make this faster. But that said, of course, none of the trims and none of the engine options are going to turn this into a direct competitor for the Explorer ST. The Explorer is a full-size smaller, it has some pretty wide tires, it's a crossover, it's definitely designed for handling ability. This is designed really more for a cushy ride, and that's really where this shines. This has an excellent highway ride. The roads out here in Southern California are pretty terrible, and you really can't feel much. Even if I switch this over into the sporty mode right here, which does firm things up a little bit, this is never going to be as firm as something like a Dodge Durango SRT or the Explorer ST. When it comes to handling, remember we're talking about an SUV that weighs nearly 6,000 pounds and has 265 or 275 with tires on it, depending on the trim that you're looking at. So this is not going to be as dynamic a vehicle as a rear-wheel drive crossover. Cabin noise appears very well controlled in here. I wasn't able to do my usual cabin noise tests, but if I were a betting man, I would guess this is going to come in right around 69 or 70 decibels. This is certainly going to be quieter than the average crossover out there. Generally, body-on-frame vehicles end up quieter because there's more isolation between the bits that are contacting the road and, of course, the part of the vehicle that you're sitting in. As I said before, that's also going to apply to trailer towing quietness. If you've towed with a pickup truck and then towed with a crossover, you'll really notice the difference. When the hitch is rattling around in the receiver of a unibody crossover, the entire vehicle sort of acts like a sounding board. And that doesn't happen in a body-on-frame SUV like this, like the Expedition, like the Armada, like the Sequoia. Now, in terms of the Armada and Sequoia competition, the Tahoe is simply light years ahead. This feels much more refined. The transmission feels more refined. We have more gears to choose from as well, so this feels a little bit less out of breath in some of those hill climbing situations, or if you were to tow with this vehicle, obviously there are going to be more gear ratios involved for that. And even though fuel economy is not especially high at 18 miles per gallon, real-world fuel economy is likely to be significantly better in this than in the Toyota or the Nissan, because this has much more modern technologies going on. This may still be a push-rotted engine, but it has all of GM's latest fuel-saving technologies, and again, the 10-speed automatic. Given that the starting price of the Tahoe is going to be over $50,000, don't worry, we'll talk about pricing here in a bit, I'm surprised that we don't have features like radar adaptive cruise control standard. Now, General Motors does give us autonomous emergency braking standard, but we don't have the same kind of standard feature content that we do find in less expensive three-row vehicles on the market. Bottom line, out on the road, I'm really impressed with the new Tahoe. A number of years ago, Ford really started shaking things up when they gave the Expedition an independent rear suspension. When it comes to ride quality and handling ability, we see the same leap forward in this generation of the Yukon versus the previous generation. But we also see greater refinement going on here than we find in the Ford, and that's, I think, thanks to the air suspension and, of course, the magnetic ride control system as well. You'll really notice that if you get this out on a rougher road and you really start pushing it harder, or just out on washboard pavement in the corners, this suspension system feels more planted than what we find in the Ford. It also is cushier, so this definitely has a better ride for those longer road trips or for executive transport. I've always thought it was a little bit odd that Tahoes and Suburbans and Expeditions, etc., are used for executive transport, for lack of a better word, black car service, chauffeur service, etc., because the ride quality, especially for the rear occupants, if it's not fully loaded, isn't really that great out on rougher road surfaces. But of course, that story has changed because now it is actually pretty good in this generation of the Tahoe. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to drive the one with the regular suspension system, so hopefully I will be able to drive that very soon. I don't know whether all those same improvements apply to that. I suspect that it's not going to ride as well, however, as this model, because again, we do have the adaptive technologies going on in here, and the regular version of the suspension is going to need to be able to support the loads with those higher payloads for the tongue weight, for the passengers, for the cargo in the rear, etc. And now to the nitty-gritty. How much is a Tahoe going to set you back? Well, for 2021, it is going to be $1,000 more than the outgoing version. The LS trim will start at $50,295, but most folks out there are probably going to want at least the LT version. That's going to be $55,095. The Premier trim, which I think is the most attractive version available, starts at $63,895, and obviously options get added onto it from there. The model that we're driving is a Z71 version. It's one of the more expensive trims, and of course this one has a ton of options on it. That's why this one's stickered for $76,175. We have the rear seat entertainment system, we have the four-corner adaptive suspension system with MagneRide, but we still have the 5.3-liter V8 engine under the hood. This does not have the 6.2. Doesn't have the diesel either. We don't know what the diesel is going to cost, but I expect that the diesel is probably going to add about $4,000. While those prices may seem high, keep in mind that the Tahoe's competition is also similarly expensive. And with the exception of the Ford Expedition, they're also pretty darn old. Although the Nissan Armada and the Toyota Sequoia have been lightly refreshed here and there over the years, the bones of those vehicles really date back quite far. The Nissan Armada was already an old vehicle by the time they finally brought it to the United States. Obviously, you're going to have to wait until I can get my hands on this for a full week for our usual run-through of pricing, comparisons, and of course, detailed 0 to 60 and 60 to 0 numbers. But I can easily say if you're shopping for a large SUV in America, the Tahoe needs to be on your shopping list because everything else in this segment, except for the Ford Expedition, is positively ancient. And the Expedition itself doesn't feel quite as fresh as the Tahoe. The Tahoe certainly has a lot going on for it, most notably the engines that we find under the hood. If you want a V8 engine in your large modern SUV, you have basically 3 options. This guy right here, the GMC version of this guy right here, and the Cadillac version of this guy right here. Now, if you want to save a little bit of money and you don't need to seat as many people, you could look at something like the Dodge Durango. It's getting a little bit of a refresh for 2021, but the bones of that vehicle are just about as old as a Toyota Sequoia. It's also not going to be quite the same thing as a Tahoe. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And of course, again, stay tuned for our full and complete review. It's going to come up in about 2 months or so. That's when I'm going to get one of these for a week at home so we can run through our usual battery of comparisons and tests, and obviously do some towing with this guy right here. I'm really looking forward to that because the Tahoe is one of the biggest SUV launches of the year. In the meantime, be sure and hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen so you can be updated on all of our latest videos. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social things, and I'll see all of you next week.